Third lecture, part 2 of On the Future of Our Educational Institutions by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by J. M. Kennedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Indeed,
said the philosopher, laughing.
There are many philologists who have turned back as you so much desire, and I notice a great contrast with my own youthful experience. Consciously or unconsciously, large numbers of them have concluded that it is hopeless and useless for them to come into direct contact with classical antiquity. Hence, they are inclined to look upon the study as barren, superseded, out of date. This herd has turned with much greater zest to the science of language. Here, in the wide expanse of virgin soil, where even the most mediocre gifts can be turned to account, and where a kind of insipidity and dullness is even looked upon as decided talent, with the novelty and uncertainty of methods and the constant danger of making fantastic mistakes. Here, where dull regimen and routine and discipline are desiderata, here the newcomer is no longer frightened by the majestic and warning voice that rises from the ruins of antiquity. Here, everyone is welcome with open arms, including him who never arrived at any uncommon impression or noteworthy thought after a perusal of Sophocles and Aristophanes, with the result that they end in an etymological tangle, or are seduced into collecting the fragments of out-of-the-way dialects. And their time is spent in associating and dissociating, collecting and scattering, and running hither and thither, consulting books, and such a usefully employed philologist would now fain be a teacher. He now undertakes to teach the youth of the public schools something about the ancient writers, although he himself has read them without any particular impression, much less with insight. What a dilemma! Antiquity has said nothing to him, consequently he has nothing to say about antiquity. A sudden thought strikes him. Why is he a skilled philologist at all? Why did these authors write in Latin and Greek? And with a light heart he immediately begins to etymologize with Homer, calling Lithuanian or ecclesiastical Slavonic or, above all, the sacred Sanskrit to his assistance, as if Greek lessons were merely the excuse for a general introduction to the study of languages, and as if Homer were lacking in only one respect, namely, not being written in pre-Indo-Germanic. Whoever is acquainted with our present public schools well knows that a wide gulf separates their teachers from classicalism, and how, from a feeling of this want, comparative philology and allied professions have increased their numbers to such an unheard-of degree.
What I mean is, said the other, it would depend upon whether a teacher of classical culture did not confuse his Greeks and Romans with the other peoples, the barbarians, whether he could never put Greek and Latin on a level with other languages. So far as his classicalism is concerned, it is a matter of indifference whether the framework of these languages concurs with or is in any way related to the other languages. Such a concurrence does not interest him at all. His real concern is with what is not common to both, with what shows him that those two people were not barbarians as compared with the others, insofar, of course, as he is a true teacher of culture, and models himself after the majestic patterns of the classics.
I may be wrong, said the philosopher, but I suspect that, owing to the way in which Latin and Greek are now taught in schools, the accurate grasp of these languages, the ability to speak and write them with ease is lost, and that is something in which my own generation distinguished itself. A generation, indeed, whose few survivors have by this time grown old, whilst, on the other hand, the present teachers seem to impress their pupils with the genetic and historical importance of the subject to such an extent that, at best, their scholars ultimately turn into little Sanskritists, etymological spitfires, or reckless conjecturers. But not one of them can read his Plato or Tacitus with pleasure, as we old folk can. The public schools may be seats of learning, not, however, of the learning, which, as it were, is only the natural and involuntary auxiliary of a culture that is directed toward the noblest end, but rather of that culture which might be compared to the hypertrophical swelling of an unhealthy body. The public schools are certainly the seat of this obesity, if, indeed, they have not degenerated into the abodes of the elegant barbarism which is boasted of as being German culture of the present.
But, asked the other, what is to become of that large body of teachers who have not been endowed with a true gift for culture, and who set up as teachers merely to gain a livelihood from the profession, because there's a demand for them, because a superfluidity of schools brings with them a superfluidity of teachers. Where shall they go when antiquity peremptorily orders them to withdraw? Must they not be sacrificed to those powers of the present who, day after day, call out to them from the never-ending columns of the press? We are culture, we are education, we are the zenith, we are the apex of the pyramids, we are the aims of the universal history. When they hear the seductive promises, when the shameful signs of non-culture, the plebeian publicity of the so-called interests of culture are extolled for their benefit in magazines and newspapers as an entirely new and the best possible, full-grown form of culture, whither shall the poor fellows fly when they feel the presentiment that these promises are not true? Where but to the most obtuse, sterile scientificality, that here the shriek of culture may no longer be audible to them? Pursued in this way, must they not end, like the ostrich, by burying their heads in the sand? Is it not a real happiness for them, buried as they are among dialects, etymologies, and conjectures, to lead a life like that of the ants, even though they are miles removed from true culture, if only they can close their ears tightly and be deaf to the voices of the elegant culture of the time?
"You are right, my friend," said the philosopher. "But whence comes the urgent necessity for a surplus of schools for culture, which further gives rise to the necessity for a surplus of teachers? When we so clearly see that demand for a surplus springs from a sphere which is hostile to culture, and that the consequences of this surplus only lead to non-culture. Indeed, we can discuss this dire necessity only in so far as the modern state is willing to discuss these things with us, and is prepared to follow up its demands by force, which phenomenon certainly makes the same impression upon most people as if they were addressed by the eternal law of things. For the rest, a culture state, to use the current expression, which makes such demands is rather a novelty and has only come to a self-understanding within the last half-century, i.e., a period when, to use the favorite popular word, so many self-understood things came into being, but which are in themselves not self-understood at all. This right to higher education has been taken so seriously by the most powerful of modern states, Prussia, that the objectionable principle it has adopted, taken in connection with the well-known daring and hardihood of this state, is seen to have a menacing and dangerous consequence for the true German spirit, for we see endeavors being made in this quarter to raise the public school, formerly systemized, up to the so-called level of the time. Here is to be found all that mechanism by means of which as many scholars as possible are urged on to take up courses of public school training. Here, indeed, the state has its most powerful inducement, the concession of certain privileges respecting military service, with the natural consequence that, according to the unprejudiced evidence of statistical officials, by this, and by this only, can we explain the universal congestion of all Prussian public schools, and the urgent and continual need for new ones. What more can the state do for a surplus of educational institutions than bring all the higher and the majority of lower civil service appointments, the right of entry to the universities, and even the most influential military posts into close connection with the public school? And all this in a country where both universal military service and the highest offices of the state unconsciously attract all gifted natures to them. The public school is here looked upon as an honorable aim, and everyone who feels himself urged on to the sphere of government will be found on his way to it. This is a new and unique original occurrence. The state assumes the attitude of a mystagogue of culture, and whilst it promotes its own ends, it obliges every one of its servants not to appear in its presence without the touch of universal state education in their hands, by the flickering light of which they may again recognize the state as the highest goal, as the reward for all their strivings after education. Now this last phenomenon should indeed surprise them. It should remind them of that allied, slowly understood tendency of a philosophy which was formerly promoted for reasons of state, namely, the tendency of the Hegelian philosophy. Yea, it would perhaps be no exaggeration to say that, in the subordination of all strivings after education to reasons of state, Prussia has appropriated, with success, the principle and the useful heirloom of the Hegelian philosophy, whose apotheosis of the state in this subordination certainly reaches its height.
But, said the philosopher's companion, what purpose can the state have in view with such a strange aim? For that it has some state objects in view is seen in the manner in which the conditions of Prussian schools are admired by, meditated upon, and occasionally imitated by other states. These other states obviously presuppose something here that, if adopted, would tend towards the maintenance and power of the state, like our well-known and popular conscription, where everyone proudly wears his soldier's uniform at regular intervals, where almost everyone has absorbed a uniform type of national culture through the public schools. Enthusiastic hyperboles may well be uttered concerning the systems employed in former times, and a form of state omnipotence which is attained only in antiquity, and which almost every young man, by both instinct and training, thinks is the crowning glory and highest aim of human beings to reach.
Such a comparison, said the philosopher, would be quite hyperbolical and would not hobble along on one leg only. For, indeed, the ancient state emphatically did not share the utilitarian point of view of recognizing as culture only what was directly useful to the state itself, and was far from wishing to destroy those impulses which did not seem to be immediately applicable. For this very reason the profound Greek had for the state that strong feeling of admiration and thankfulness which is so distasteful to modern men, because he clearly recognized not only that without such state protection the germs of his culture could not develop, but also that all his inimitable and perennial culture had flourished so luxuriantly under the wise and careful guardianship of the protection afforded by the state. The state was for his culture not a supervisor, regulator, and watchman, but a vigorous and muscular companion and friend, ready for war, who accompanied his noble, admired, and, as it were, ethereal friend through disagreeable reality, earning his thanks therefor. This, however, does not happen when a modern state lays claim to such hearty gratitude because it renders such chivalrous service to German culture and art. For in this regard its past is as ignominious as its present, as a proof of which we have but to think of the manner in which the memory of our great poets and artists is celebrated in German cities, and how the highest objects of these German masters are supported on the part of the state. There must therefore be peculiar circumstances surrounding both this purpose towards which the state is tending, and which always promotes what is here called education, and surrounding likewise the culture thus promoted, which subordinates itself to this purpose of the state, with the real German spirit and the education derived therefrom, such as I have slowly outlined for you. This purpose of the state is at war, hidden or openly. The spirit of education, which is welcomed and encouraged with such interest by the state, and owing to which the schools of this country are so much admired abroad, must accordingly originate in a sphere that never comes into contact with this true German spirit, with that spirit which speaks to us so wondrously from the inner heart of the German Reformation, German music, and German philosophy, and which, like a noble exile, is regarded with such indifference and scorn by the luxurious education afforded by the state. This spirit is a stranger. It passes by in solitary sadness, and far away from it the censer of pseudo-culture is swung backwards and forwards, which, amidst the acclamations of educated teachers and journalists, arrogates to itself its name and privileges, and metes out insulting treatment to the word German. Why does the state require that surplus of educational institutions of teachers? Why this education of the masses on such an extended scale? Because the true German spirit is hated. Because the aristocratic nature of true culture is feared, because the people endeavor in this way to drive single great individuals into self-exile, so that the claims of the masses to education may be, so to speak, planted down and carefully tended in order that the many may in this way endeavor to escape the rigid and strict discipline of the few great leaders, so that the masses may be persuaded that they can easily find the path for themselves, following the guiding star of the state. A new phenomenon. The state is the guiding star of culture. In the meantime, one thing consoles me. This German spirit, which people are combating so much and for which they have substituted a gaudy attired locum tenens. This spirit is brave. It will fight and redeem itself into a purer age. Noble, as it is now, and victorious, as it one day will be, it will always preserve in its mind a certain pitiful toleration of the state. If the latter, hard-pressed in the hour of extremity, secures such a pseudo-culture as its associate. For what, after all, do we know about the difficult task of governing men, i.e., to keep law, order, quietness, and peace among millions of boundlessly egotistical, unreasonable, dishonorable, envious, malignant, and hence very narrow-minded and perverse human beings? And thus to protect the few things that the state has conquered for itself, covetous neighbors and jealous robbers? Such a hard-pressed state holds out its arms to any associate, grasps at any straw, and when such an associate does introduce himself with flowery eloquence, when he adjudges the state, as Hegel did, to be an absolutely complete ethical organism, the be-all and end-all of everyone's education, and goes on to indicate how he himself can best promote the interests of the state, who will be surprised if, without further parley, the state falls upon his neck and cries aloud in a barbaric voice of full conviction, "Yes, thou art education, thou art indeed culture."
End of third lecture. Fourth lecture, part 1 of On the Future of Our Educational Institutions by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translated by J. M. Kennedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Delivered on the 5th of March, 1872. Ladies and gentlemen, now that you have followed my tale up to this point, and that we have made ourselves joint masters of the solitary, remote, and at times abusive duologue of the philosopher and his companion, I sincerely hope that you, like strong swimmers, are ready to proceed on the second half of our journey, especially as I can promise you that a few other marionettes will appear in the puppet play of my adventure, and that if up to the present you have only been able to do little more than endure what I have been telling you, the waves of my story will now bear you more quickly and easily towards the end. In other words, we have now come to a turning, and it would be advisable for us to take a short glance backward to see what we think we have gained from such varied conversation.
"Remain in your present position,"
the philosopher seemed to say to his companion,
"for you may cherish hopes. It is more and more clearly evident that we have no educational institutions at all, but that we ought to have them. Our public schools, established, it would seem, for this high object, have either become the nurseries of a reprehensible culture which repels the true culture with profound hatred, i.e., a true aristocratic culture founded upon a few carefully chosen minds, or they foster a micrological and sterile learning which, while it is far removed from culture, has at least this merit, that it avoids that reprehensible culture as well as the true culture."
The philosopher had particularly drawn his companion's attention to the strange corruption which must have entered into the hearts of culture when the state of thought itself capable of tyrannizing over it and attaining its ends through it, and further when the state, in conjunction with this culture, struggled against other hostile forces as well as against the spirit, which the philosopher ventured to call the
true German spirit.
This spirit, linked to the Greeks by the noblest ties and shown by its past history to have been steadfast and courageous, pure and lofty in its aims, its faculties qualifying it for the high task of freeing modern man from the curse of modernity. The spirit is condemned to live apart, banished from its inheritance. But when its slow, painful tones of woe resound through the desert of the present, then the overladen and gaily decorated caravan of culture is pulled up short, horror-stricken. We must not only astonish, but terrify. Such was the philosopher's opinion. Not to fly shamefully away, but to take the offensive, was his advice. But he especially counseled his companion not to ponder too anxiously over the individual from whom, through a higher instinct, this aversion for the present barbarism proceeded.
"Let it perish. The Pythian god had no difficulty in finding a new tripod, a second Pythia, so long, at least, as the mystic cold vapors rose from the earth."
The philosopher once more began to speak.
"Be careful to remember, my friend," he said, "there are two things you must not confuse. A man must learn a great deal that he may live and take part in the struggle for existence. But everything that he as an individual learns and does with this end in view has nothing whatever to do with culture." This latter only takes its beginning in a sphere that lies far above the world of necessity, indulgence, and the struggle for existence. The question now is to what extent a man values his ego in comparison with other egos, how much of his strength he uses up in the endeavor to earn his living. Many a one, by stoically confining his needs within a narrow compass, will shortly and easily reach the sphere in which he may forget and, as it were, shake off his ego, so that he can enjoy perpetual youth in a solar system of timeless and impersonal things. Another widens the scope and needs of his ego as much as possible, and builds the mausoleum of his ego in vast proportions, as if he were well prepared to fight and conquer that terrible adversary, time. In this instinct also we may see a longing for immortality, wealth and power, wisdom, presence of mind, eloquence, a flourishing outward aspect, a renowned name. All of these are merely turned into the means by which an insatiable, personal will to live craves for a new life, with which, again, it hankers after an eternity that is at least seen to be illusory. But even in this highest form of ego, in the enhanced needs of such a distended and, as it were, collective individual, true culture is never touched upon. And if, for example, art is sought after, only its disseminating and stimulating actions come into prominence, i.e., those which least give rise to pure and noble art, and most of all to low and degraded forms of it. For in all his efforts, however great and exceptional they seem to the onlooker, he never succeeds in freeing himself from his own hankering and restless personality, that illuminated, ethereal sphere where one may contemplate without the obstruction of one's own personality continually recedes from him. And thus, let him learn, travel, and collect as he may, he must always live an exiled life at a remote distance from a higher life and from true culture. For true culture would scorn to contaminate itself with the needy and covetous individual. It well knows how to give the slip to the man who would fain employ it as a means of attaining to egotistic ends, and if any one cherishes the belief that he has firmly secured it as a means of livelihood, and that he can procure the necessities of life by its sedulous cultivation, then it suddenly steals away with noiseless steps and an air of derisive mockery. I will thus ask you, my friend, not to confound this culture, this sensitive, fastidious, ethereal goddess, with that useful maid-of-all-work which is also called culture, but which is only the intellectual servant and counselor of one's practical necessities, wants, and means of livelihood. Every kind of training, however, which holds out the prospect of breadwinning as its end and aim, is not a training for culture as we understand the word, but merely a collection of precepts and directions to show how, in the struggle for existence, a man may preserve and protect his own person. It may be freely admitted that for the great majority of men such a course of instruction is of the highest importance, and the more arduous the struggle is, the more intensely must the young man strain every nerve to utilize his strength to the best advantage. But let no one think for a moment that the schools which urge him on this struggle and prepare him for it are in any way seriously to be considered as establishments of culture. They are institutions which teach one how to take part in the battle of life, whether they promise to turn out civil servants, or merchants, or officers, or wholesale dealers, or farmers, or physicians, or men with a technical training. The regulations and standards prevailing at such institutions differ from those in a true educational institution, and what in the latter is permitted, and even freely held out as often as possible, ought to be considered as a criminal offense in the former. Let me give you an example. If you wish to guide a young man on the path of true culture, beware of interpreting his naive, confident, and, as it were, immediate and personal relationship with nature. The woods, the rocks, the winds, the vulture, the flowers, the butterfly, the meads, the mountain slopes, must all speak to him in their own language. In them he must, as it were, come to know himself again in countless reflections and images, in a variegated round of changing visions, and in this way he will unconsciously and gradually feel the metaphysical unity of all things in the great image of nature, and at the same time tranquilize his soul in the contemplation of her eternal endurance and necessity. But how many young men should be permitted to grow up in such close and almost personal proximity to nature? The others must learn another truth betimes, how to subdue nature to themselves. Here is an end of this naive metaphysics, and the physiology of plants and animals, geology, inorganic chemistry, force their devotees to view nature from an altogether different standpoint. What is lost by this new point of view is not only a poetical phantasmagoria, but the instinctive, true, and unique point of view, instead of which we have shrewd and clever calculations, and, so to speak, overreachings of nature. Thus, to the truly cultured man is vouchsafed the inestimable belief of being able to remain faithful, without a break, to the contemplative instincts of his childhood, and so to attain to a calmness, unity, consistency, and harmony which can never even be thought of by a man who is compelled to fight in the struggle for existence. You must not think, however, that I wish to withhold all praise from our primary and secondary schools. I honor the seminaries where boys learn arithmetic and master modern languages, and study geography and the marvelous discoveries made in natural science. I'm quite prepared to say further that those youths who pass through the better classes of secondary schools are well entitled to make the claims put forward by the fully fledged public school boy. And the time is certainly not far distant when such pupils will be everywhere freely admitted to the universities and positions under the government, which has hitherto been the case only with scholars from the public schools, of our present public schools, be it noted. I cannot, however, refrain from adding the melancholy reflection. If it be true that secondary and public schools are, on the whole, working so heartily in common towards the same end, and differ from each other in only such a slight degree that they may take equal rank before the tribunal of the state, then we completely lack another kind of educational institutions, those for the development of culture. To say the least, the secondary schools cannot be reproached with this, for they have up to the present propitiously and honorably followed up tendencies of a lower order, but for one nevertheless highly necessary. In the public schools, however, there is much less honesty and very much less ability too, for in them we find an instinctive feeling of shame, the unconscious perception of the fact that the whole institution has been ignominiously degraded, and that the sonorous words of wise and apathetic teachers are contradictory to the dreary, barbaric, and sterile reality. So there are no true cultural institutions. And in those very places where a pretense to culture is still kept up, we find the people more hopeless, atrophied, and discontented than in the secondary schools, where the so-called realistic subjects are taught. Besides this, only think how immature and uninformed one must be in the company of such teachers when one actually misunderstands the rigorously defined philosophical expressions real and realism to such a degree as to think them the contraries of mind and matter, and to interpret realism as the road to knowledge, formation, and mastery of reality. I, for my own part, know of only two exact contraries: institutions for teaching culture and institutions for teaching how to succeed in life. All our present institutions belong to the second class, but I am speaking only of the first.
About 2 hours went by while the philosophically minded couple chatted about such startling questions. Night slowly fell in the meantime, and when in the twilight the philosopher's voice had sounded like natural music through the woods, it now rang out in the profound darkness of the night when he was speaking with excitement or even passionately, his tones hissing and thundering far down the valley and reverberating among the trees and rocks. Suddenly, he was silent. He had just repeated, almost pathetically, the words, "We have no true educational institutions. We have no true educational institutions." When something fell down just in front of him, it might have been a fir cone, and his dog barked and ran towards it. Thus interrupted, the philosopher raised his head and suddenly became aware of the darkness, the cool air, and the lonely situation of himself and his companion.
"Well, what are we about?"
he ejaculated.
"It's dark. You know whom we were expecting here, but he hasn't come. We've waited in vain. Let us go."
I must now, ladies and gentlemen, convey to you the impressions experienced by my friend and myself as we eagerly listened to this conversation, which we heard distinctly in our hiding place. I have already told you that at that place and at that hour we had intended to hold a festival in commemoration of something, and this something had to do with nothing else than matters concerning educational training, of which we, in our own youthful opinions, had garnered a plentiful harvest during our past life. We were thus disposed to remember with gratitude the institution which we had at one time thought out for ourselves at that very spot in order, as I have already mentioned, that we might reciprocally encourage and watch over one another's educational impulses. But a sudden and unexpected light was thrown on all that past life as we silently gave ourselves up to the vehement words of the philosopher. As when a traveler walking heedlessly across unknown ground suddenly puts his foot over the edge of a cliff, so it now seemed to us that we had hastened to meet the great danger rather than run away from it. Here at this spot, so memorable to us, we heard the warning, "Back, not another step. Know you not whither your footsteps tend, whether this deceitful path is luring you?" It seemed to us that we now knew, and our feelings of overflowing thankfulness impelled us so irresistibly towards our earnest counselor and trusty Eckhart, that both of us sprang up at the moment and rushed towards the philosopher to embrace him. He was just about to move off, and had already turned sideways when we rushed up to him. The dog turned sharply round and barked, thinking doubtless, like the philosopher's companion, of an attempt at robbery rather than an enraptured embrace. It was plain that he had forgotten us. In a word, he ran away. Our embrace was a miserable failure when we did overtake him, for my friend gave a loud yell as the dog bit him, and the philosopher himself sprang away from me with such force that we both fell. What with the dog and the men, there was a scramble that lasted a few minutes, until my friend began to call out loudly, parroting the philosopher's own words. "In the name of all culture and pseudo-culture, what does the silly dog want with us? Hence, you confounded dog, you uninitiated, never to be initiated, hasten away from us, silent and unashamed." After this outburst, matters were cleared up to some extent, at any rate so far as they could be cleared up in the darkness of the wood.
"Oh, it's you," ejaculated the philosopher. "Our duelists. How you startled us. What on earth drives you to jump out upon us like this at such a time of the night?"
"Joy, thankfulness, and reverence," said we, shaking the old man by the hand whilst the dog barked as if he understood. "We can't let you go without telling you this, and if you are to understand everything, you must not go away just yet. We want to ask you about so many things that lie heavily on our hearts. Stay yet a while. We know every foot of the way and can accompany you afterwards. The gentleman you expect may yet turn up. Look over yonder on the Rhine. What is that we see so clearly floating on the surface of the water as if surrounded by the light of many torches? It is there that we may look for your friend. I would even venture to say that it is he who is coming towards you with all those lights." And so much did we assail the surprised old man with our entreaties, promises, and fantastic delusions that we persuaded the philosopher to walk to and fro with us on the little plateau. "By learned lumber undisturbed," as my friend added.
"Shame on you," said the philosopher. "If you really want to quote something, why choose Faust? However, I will give in to you, quotation or no quotation, if only our young companions will keep still and not run away as suddenly as they made their appearance. For they are like will-o'-the-wisps. We are amazed when they are there, and again when they are not there."
My friend immediately recited, "Respect, I hope, will teach us how we may our lighter disposition keep at bay. Our course is only zigzag, as a rule." The philosopher was surprised, and stood still.
"You astonish me, you will-o'-the-wisps," he said.
This is no quagmire we are on now. Of what use is this ground to you? What does the proximity of a philosopher mean to you? For around him the air is sharp and clear, the ground dry and hard. We must find out a more fantastic region for your zigzagging inclinations.
I think, interrupted the philosopher's companion at this point, the gentlemen have already told us that they promised to meet someone here at this hour, but it seems to me that they listened to our comedy of education like a chorus, and truly idealistic spectators, for they did not disturb us. We thought we were alone with each other.
Yes, that is true,
said the philosopher.
That praise must not be withheld from them, but it seems to me that they deserve still higher praise.
Here I seized the philosopher's hand and said, That man must be as obtuse as a reptile, with his stomach on the ground and his head buried in mud. Who can listen to such a discourse as yours without becoming earnest and thoughtful, or even excited and indignant? Self-accusation and annoyance might perhaps cause a few to get angry, but our impression was quite different. The only thing I do not know is how exactly to describe it. This hour was so well timed for us, and our minds were so well prepared that we sat there like empty vessels, and now it seems as if we're filled to overflowing with this new wisdom. For I no longer know how to help myself, and if someone asks me what I am thinking of doing tomorrow, or what I have made up my mind to do with myself from now on, I should not know what to answer. For it is easy to see that we have up to the present been living and educating ourselves in the wrong way. But what can we do to cross over the chasm between today and tomorrow? Yes, acknowledged my friend. I have a similar feeling, and I ask the same question. But besides that, I feel as if I were frightened away from German culture by entertaining such high and ideal views of its task. Yea, as if I were unworthy to cooperate with it in carrying out its aims. I only see a resplendent file of the highest natures moving towards this goal. I can imagine over what abysses and through what temptations this procession travels. Who would dare to be so bold as to join in it? At this point the philosopher's companion again turned to him and said, Don't be angry with me when I tell you that I too have a somewhat similar feeling, which I have not mentioned to you before. When talking to you I often felt drawn out of myself, as it were, and inspired with your ardor and hope till I almost forgot myself. Then a calmer moment arrives, a piercing wind of reality brings me back to earth, and then I see the wide gulf between us, over which you yourself, as in a dream, draw me back again. Then what you call culture merely totters meaninglessly around me or lies heavily on my breast. It is like a shirt of mail that weighs me down, or a sword that I cannot wield. End of 4th lecture, part 1. Fourth lecture, part 2 of On the Future of Our Educational Institutions by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by J. M. Kennedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our minds, as we thus argued with the philosopher, were unanimous and mutually encouraging and stimulating one another. We slowly walked with him backwards and forwards along the unencumbered space which had earlier in the day served us as a shooting range, and then, in the still night, under the peaceful light of hundreds of stars, we all broke out into a tirade which ran somewhat as follows. You have told us so much about the genius, we began, about his lonely and wearisome journey through the world, as if nature never exhibited anything but the most diametrical contraries. In one place the stupid, dull masses, acting by instinct, and then, on a far higher and more remote plane, the great contemplating few, destined for the production of immortal works. But now you call these apexes of the intellectual pyramid. It would, however, seem that beyond the broad, heavily burdened foundation up to the highest of the free and unencumbered peaks there must be countless intermediate degrees, and that here we must apply the saying, natura non facit saltus. Where then are we to look for the beginning of what you call culture? Where is the line of demarcation to be drawn between the spheres which are ruled from below upwards and those which are ruled from above downwards? And if it be only in connection with these exalted beings that true culture may be spoken of, how are institutions to be founded for the uncertain existence of such natures? How can we devise educational establishments which shall be of benefit only to these select few? It rather seems to us that such persons know how to find their own way, and that their full strength is shown in their being able to walk without the educational crutches necessary for other people, and thus undisturbed to make their way through the storm and stress of this rough world just like a phantom. We kept on arguing in this fashion, speaking without any great ability and not putting our thoughts in any special form, but the philosopher's companion went even further and said to him, Just think of all these great geniuses of whom we are wont to be so proud, looking upon them as a tried and true leaders and guides of this real German spirit, whose names we commemorate by statues and festivals, and whose works we hold up with feelings of pride for the admiration of foreign lands. How did they obtain the education you demand for them? To what degree do they show that they have been nourished and matured by basking in the sun of national education? And yet they are seen to be possible. They have nevertheless become men whom we must honor. Yea, their works themselves justify the form of the development of these noble spirits. They justify even a certain want of education for which we must make allowance owing to their country and the age in which they lived. How could Lessing and Winckelmann benefit by the German culture of their time? Even less than, or at all events just as little as Beethoven, Schiller, Goethe, or even one of our great poets and artists. It may perhaps be a law of nature that only the later generations are destined to know by what divine gifts an earlier generation was favored. At this point the old philosopher could not control his anger, and shouted to his companion,
"Oh, you innocent lamb of knowledge, you gentle sucking doves, all of you! And would you give the name of arguments to those distorted, clumsy, narrow-minded, ungainly, crippled things? Yes, I have just now been listening to the fruits of some of this present-day culture, and my ears are still ringing with the sound of historical, self-understood things, of overwise and pitiless historical reasonings. Mark this, thou unprofane nature, thou hast grown old, and for thousands of years this starry sky has spanned the space above thee, but thou hast never yet heard such conceited and, at bottom, mischievous chatter as the talk of the present day. So you are proud of your poets and artists, my good Teutons. You point to them and brag about them to foreign countries, do you? And because it has given you no trouble to have them amongst you, you have formed a pleasant theory that you need not concern yourselves further with them. Isn't that so, my inexperienced children? They come of their own free will. The stork brings them to you. Who would dare to mention a midwife? You deserve an earnest teaching, eh? You should be proud of the fact that all the noble and brilliant men we have mentioned were prematurely suffocated, worn out, and crushed through your barbarism. You think without shame of Lessing, who, on account of your stupidity, perished in battle against your ludicrous gods and idols, the evils of your theatres, you learned men, and your theologians, without once daring to lift himself to the height of that immortal flight for which he was brought into the world. And what are your impressions when you think of Winckelmann, who, that he might rid his eyes of your grotesque fatuousness, went to beg help from the Jesuits, and whose disgraceful religious conversion recoils upon you and will always remain an ineffaceable blemish upon you? You can even name Schiller without blushing. Just look at his picture. The fiery, sparkling eyes look at you with disdain, those flushed, death-like cheeks. Can you learn nothing from all that? In him you had a beautiful and divine plaything, and through it was destroyed. And if it had been possible for you to take Goethe's friendship away from this melancholy, hasty life, hunted to premature death, and then you would have crushed him even sooner than you did. You have not rendered assistance to a single one of our great geniuses, and now upon that fact you wish to build up the theory that none of them shall ever be helped in the future? For each of them, however, up to this very moment you have always been the resistance of the stupid world that Goethe speaks of in his Epilogue to the Bell. Towards each of them you act the part of apathetic dullards, or jealous narrow hearts, or malignant egotists. In spite of you they created their immortal works, against you they directed their attacks, and thanks to you they died so prematurely, their tasks only half accomplished, blunted and dulled and shattered in the battle. Who can tell to what these heroic men were destined to attain if only that true German spirit had gathered them together within the protecting walls of a powerful institution? That spirit which, without the help of some such institution, drags out an isolated, debased, and degraded existence. All those great men were utterly ruined, and it is only an insane belief in the Hegelian reasonableness of all happenings which would absolve you of any responsibility in the matter. And not those men alone. Indictments are pouring forth against you from every intellectual province, whether I look at the talents of our poets, philosophers, painters, or sculptors, and not only in the case of gifts of the highest order. I everywhere see immaturity, overstrained nerves, or prematurely exhausted energies, abilities wasted and nipped in the bud. I everywhere feel that resistance of the stupid world, in other words, your guiltiness. That is what I'm speaking about when I speak of lacking educational establishments, and why I think those which at present claim the name in such a pitiful condition. Whoever is pleased to call this an ideal desire, and refers to it as ideal as if he were trying to get rid of it by praising me, deserves the answer that the present system is a scandal and a disgrace, and that the man who asks for warmth in the midst of ice and snow must indeed get angry if he hears this referred to as an ideal desire. The matter we are now discussing is concerned with clear, urgent, and palpably evident realities. A man who knows anything of the question feels there is a need which must be seen to, just like cold and hunger. But the man who is not affected at all by this matter most certainly has a standard by which to measure the extent of his own culture, and thus to know what I call culture, and where the line should be drawn between that which is ruled from below upwards, and that which is ruled from above downwards."
The philosopher seemed to be speaking very heatedly. We begged him to walk round with us again, since he had uttered the latter part of his discourse standing near the tree stump which had served us as a target. For a few minutes not a word more was spoken. Slowly and thoughtfully we walked to and fro. We did not so much feel ashamed of having brought forward such foolish arguments as we felt a kind of restitution of our personality. After the heated and, so far as we were concerned, very unflattering utterance of the philosopher, we seemed to feel ourselves nearer to him, that we even stood in a personal relationship to him. For so wretched is man that he never feels himself brought into such close contact with the stranger as when the latter shows some sign of weakness, some defect. That our philosopher had lost his temper and made use of abusive language helped to bridge over the gulf created between us by our timid respect for him, and for the sake of the reader who feels his indignation rising at this suggestion, let it be added that this bridge often leads from distant hero worship to personal love and pity. And, after the feeling that our personality had been restored to us, this pity gradually became stronger and stronger. Why were we making this old man walk up and down with us between the rocks and trees at that time of the night? And, since he had yielded to our entreaties, why could we not have thought of a more modest and unassuming manner of having ourselves instructed? Why should the three of us have contradicted him in such clumsy terms? For now we saw how thoughtless, unprepared, and baseless were all the objections we had made, and how greatly the echo of the present was heard in them, the voice of which, in the province of culture, the old man would fain not have heard. Our objections, however, were not purely intellectual ones. Our reasons for protesting against the philosopher's statements seemed to lie elsewhere. They arose perhaps from the instinctive anxiety to know whether, if the philosopher's views were carried into effect, our own personalities would find a place in the higher or lower division. And this made it necessary for us to find some arguments against the mode of thinking which robbed us of our self-styled claims to culture. People, however, should not argue with companions who feel the weight of an argument so personally, or, as the moral in our case would have been, such companions should not argue, should not contradict at all. So we walked on beside the philosopher, ashamed, compassionate, dissatisfied with ourselves, and more than ever convinced that the old man was right, and that we had done him wrong. How remote now seemed the youthful dream of our educational institution. How clearly we saw the danger which we had hitherto escaped merely by good luck, namely, giving ourselves up body and soul to the educational system which forced itself upon our notice so enticingly, from the time we entered the public schools up to that moment. How then had it come about that we had not taken our places in the chorus of its admirers? Perhaps merely because we were real students and could still draw back from the rough and tumble, the pushing and struggling, the restless, ever-breaking waves of publicity, to seek refuge in our own little educational establishment, which, however, time would soon have swallowed up also. Overcome by such reflections, we were about to address the philosopher again, when he suddenly turned towards us and said in a softer tone, "I cannot be surprised if you young men behave rashly and thoughtlessly, for it is hardly likely that you've ever seriously considered what I have just said to you. Don't be in a hurry. Carry this question about with you, and do at any rate consider it day and night. For you are now at the parting of the ways, and now you know where each path leads. If you take one, your age will receive you with open arms. You will not find it wanting in honors and decorations. You will form units of an enormous rank and file, and there will be as many people like-minded standing behind you as in front of you. And when the leader gives the word, it will be re-echoed from rank to rank. For here your first duty is this, to fight in rank and file, and your second, to annihilate all those who refuse to form part of the rank and file. On the other path, you will have but few fellow travelers. It is more arduous, winding, and precipitous, and those who take the first path will mock you, for your progress is more wearisome, and they will try to lure you over into their ranks. When the two paths happen to cross, however, you will be roughly handled and thrust aside, or else shunned and isolated. Now,
Take these two parties, so different from each other in every respect, and tell me what meaning an educational establishment would have for them. That enormous horde, crowding onwards on their first path towards its goal, would take the term to mean an institution by which each of its members would become duly qualified to take his place in the rank and file, and would be purged of everything which might tend to make him strive after higher and more remote aims. I don't deny, of course, that they could find pompous words with which to describe their aims. For example, they speak of the universal development of free personality upon a firm social, national, and human basis, or they announce as their goal the founding of the peaceful sovereignty of the people upon reason, education, and justice. An educational establishment for the other and smaller company, however, would be something vastly different. They would employ it to prevent themselves from being separated from one another, and overwhelmed by the first huge crowd to prevent their few select spirits from losing sight of their splendid and noble task through premature weariness, or from being turned aside from the true path, corrupted or subverted. These select spirits must complete their work, that is the raison d'etre of their common institution, a work, indeed, which, as it were, must be free from subjective traces, and must further rise above the transient events of future times as the pure reflection of the eternal and immutable essence of things. And all those who occupy places in that institution must cooperate in the endeavor to engender men of genius by this purification from subjectiveness and the creation of the works of genius. Not a few, even of those whose talents may be of the second or third order, are suited to such cooperation, and only when serving in such an educational establishment as this do they feel that they are truly carrying out their life's task. But now it is just these talents I speak of which are drawn away from the true path, and their instincts estranged by the continual seductions of that modern culture. The egotistic emotions, weakness, and vanities of these few select minds are continually assailed by the temptations unceasingly murmured into their ears by the spirit of the age. Come with me. There you are, servants, retainers, tools, eclipsed by higher natures. Your own peculiar characteristics never have free play. You're tied down, chained down, like slaves, yea, like automata. Here, with me, you will enjoy the freedom of your own personalities, as masters should. Your talents will cast their luster on yourselves alone. With their aid you may come to the very front rank. An innumerable train of followers will accompany you, and the applause of public opinion will yield you more pleasure than a nobly bestowed commendation from the height of genius. Even the very best of men now yield to these temptations, and it cannot be said that the deciding factor here is the degree of talent, or whether a man is accessible to these voices or not, but rather the degree and the height of a certain moral sublimity, the instinct towards heroism, towards sacrifice, and finally a positive, habitual need of culture, prepared by a proper kind of education, which education, as I have previously said, is first and foremost obedience and submission to the discipline of genius. Of this discipline and submission, however, the present institutions, called by courtesy educational establishments, know nothing whatever, although I have no doubt that the public school was originally intended to be an institution for sowing the seeds of true culture, or at least as preparation for it. I have no doubt, either, that they took the first bold steps in the wonderful and stirring times of the Reformation, and that afterwards, in the era which gave birth to Schiller and Goethe, there was again a growing demand for culture, like the first protuberance of that wing spoken of by Plato in the Phaedrus, which, at every contact with the beautiful, bears the soul aloft into the upper regions, the habitations of the gods.
Ah, began the philosopher's companion, when you quote the divine Plato in the world of ideas, I do not think you are angry with me, however much of my previous utterance may have merited your disapproval and wrath. As soon as you speak of it, I feel the Platonic wing rising within me, and it is only at intervals, when I act as the charioteer of my soul, that I have any difficulty with the resisting and unwilling horse that Plato has also described to us, the crooked, lumbering animal put together anyhow with a short, thick neck, flat-faced, and of a dark color, with gray eyes and a blood-red complexion. the mate of insolence and pride, shag-eared and deaf, hardly yielding to whip or spur. Just think of how long I have lived at a distance from you, and how all those temptations you speak of have endeavored to lure me away, not perhaps without some success, even though I myself may not have observed it. I now see more clearly than ever the necessity for an institution which will enable us to live and mix freely with the few men of true culture, so that we may have them as our leaders and guiding stars. How greatly I feel the danger of traveling alone! And when it occurred to me that I could save myself by flight from all contact with the spirit of time, I found that this flight itself was a mere delusion. Continuously, with every breath we take, some amount of that atmosphere circulates through every vein and artery, and no solitude is lonesome or distant enough for us to be out of reach of its fogs and clouds. Whether in the guise of hope, doubt, profit, or virtue, the shades of that culture hover about us, and we have been deceived by that jugglery, even here in the presence of a true hermit of culture. How steadfastly and faithfully must the few followers of that culture, which might almost be called sectarian, be ever on the alert. How they must strengthen and uphold one another. How adversely would any errors be criticized here, and how sympathetically excused. And thus, teacher, I ask you to pardon me, after you have labored so earnestly to set me in the right path.
You use a language which I do not care for, my friend, said the philosopher, and one which reminds me of a diocesan conference. With that I have nothing to do, but your Platonic horse pleases me, and on its account you shall be forgiven. I am willing to exchange my own animal for yours, but it is getting chilly, and I don't feel inclined to walk about any more just now. The friend I was waiting for is indeed foolish enough to come up here even at midnight, if he promised to do so. But I have waited in vain for the signal agreed upon, and I cannot guess what has delayed him. For as a rule he is punctual, as we old men are wont to be, something that you young men nowadays look upon as old-fashioned. But he has left me in the lurch for once. How annoying it is! Come away with me. It's time to go.
At this moment, something happened. End of 4th lecture, Part 2. Fifth lecture, Part 1 of On the Future of Our Educational Institutions by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by J. M. Kennedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Delivered on the 23rd of March, 1872. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have lent a sympathetic ear to what I have told you about the heated argument of our philosopher in the stillness of that memorable night, you must have felt as disappointed as we did when he announced his peevish intention. You will remember that he had suddenly told us he wished to go, for, having been left in the lurch by his friend in the first place, and, in the second, having been bored rather than animated by the remarks addressed to him by his companion and ourselves when walking backwards and forwards on the hillside, he now apparently wanted to put an end to what appeared to him to be a useless discussion. It must have seemed to him that his day had been lost, and he would have liked to blot it out of his memory, together with the recollection of ever having made our acquaintance. And we were thus rather unwillingly preparing to depart when something else suddenly brought him to a standstill, and the foot he had just raised sank hesitantly to the ground again. A colored flame, making a crackling noise for a few seconds, attracted our attention from the direction of the Rhine, and immediately following upon this we heard a slow, harmonious call, quite in tune, although plainly the cry of numerous youthful voices.
"That's a signal," exclaimed the philosopher.
"So my friend is really coming, and I haven't waited for nothing after all. It will be a midnight meeting indeed, but how am I to let him know that I am still here? Come, your pistols, let us see your talent once again. Did you hear the severe rhythm of that melody saluting us? Mark it well, and answer it in the same rhythm by a series of shots."
This was a task well suited to our tastes and abilities, so we loaded up as quickly as we could and pointed our weapons at the brilliant stars in the heaven, whilst the echo of that piercing cry died away in the distance. The reports of the first, second, and third shots sounded sharply in the stillness, and then the philosopher cried,
"False time!"
as our rhythm was suddenly interrupted, for, like a lightning flash, a shooting star tore its way across the clouds after the third report, and almost involuntarily our fourth and fifth shots were sent after in the direction it had taken.
False time, said the philosopher again. Who told you to shoot stars? They can fall well enough without you. People should know what they want before they begin to handle weapons.
And then we once more heard that loud melody from the waters of the Rhine, intoned by numerous and strong voices.
They understand us, said the philosopher, laughing. And who indeed could resist when such a dazzling phantom comes within range?
Hush, interrupted his friend. What sort of company can it be that returns the signal to us in such a way? I should say there were between 20 and 40 strong, manly voices in that crowd. And where would such a number come from to greet us? They don't appear to have left the opposite bank of the Rhine yet. But at any rate, we must have a look at them from our own side of the river. Come along quickly. We were then standing near the top of the hill, you may remember, and our view of the river was interrupted by a dark, thick wood. On the other hand, as I have told you, from the quiet little spot which we had left we could have a better view than from the little plateau on the hillside. And the Rhine, with the island of Nonneworth in the middle, was just visible to the beholder who peered over the tree-tops. We therefore set off hastily towards this little spot, taking care, however, not to go too quickly for the philosopher's comfort. The night was pitch dark, and we seemed to find our way by instinct rather than by clearly distinguishing the path, as we walked down with the philosopher in the middle. We had scarcely reached our side of the river when a broad and fiery, yet dull and uncertain light shot up, which plainly came from the opposite side of the Rhine. "Those are torches," I cried. "There's nothing surer than that my comrades from Bonn are over yonder, and that your friend must be with them. It is they who sang that peculiar song, and they have doubtless accompanied your friend here. See, listen! They are putting off in little boats. The whole torchlight procession will have arrived here in less than half an hour." The philosopher jumped back.
"What did you say?" he ejaculated. "Your comrades from Bonn? Students? Can my friend have come here with students?"
This question, uttered almost wrathfully, provoked us. "What's your objection to students?" we demanded, but there was no answer. It was only after a pause that the philosopher slowly began to speak, not addressing us directly, as it were, but rather someone in the distance.
"So, my friend, even at midnight, even on the top of a lonely mountain, we shall not be alone, and you yourself are bringing a pack of mischief-making students along with you, although you well know that I am only too glad to get out of the way of hoc genus omne. I don't quite understand you, my friend. It must mean something when we arrange to meet after a long separation at such an out-of-the-way place and at such an unusual hour. Why should we want a crowd of witnesses, and such witnesses? What galls us together today is least of all a sentimental, soft-hearted necessity, for both of us learnt early in life to live alone in dignified isolation. It was not for our own sakes, not to show our tender feelings towards each other, or to perform an unrehearsed act of friendship, that we decided to meet here, but that here, where I once came suddenly upon you as you sat in majestic solitude, we might earnestly deliberate with each other like knights of a new order. Let them listen to us who can understand us. But why should you bring with you a throng of people who don't understand us? I don't know what you mean by such a thing, my friend."
We did not think it proper to interrupt the dissatisfied old grumbler, and as he came to a melancholy close, we did not dare tell him how greatly this distrustful repudiation of students vexed us. At last the philosopher's companion turned to him and said, "I am reminded of the fact that even you at one time, before our major acquaintance, occupied posts in several universities, and that reports concerning your intercourse with the students and your methods of instruction at the time are still in circulation. From the tone of resignation in which you have just referred to students, many would be inclined to think that you had some peculiar experiences which were not at all to your liking. But personally, I rather believe that you saw and experienced in such places just what everyone else saw and experienced in them, but that you judged what you saw and felt more justly and severely than anyone else. For, during the time I have known you, I have learned that the most noteworthy, instructive, and decisive experiences and events in one's life are those which are of daily occurrence, that the greatest riddle, displayed in full view of all, is seen by the fewest to be the greatest riddle, and that these problems are spread about in every direction, under the very feet of the passer-by, for the few real philosophers to lift up carefully, thenceforth to shine as diamonds of wisdom. Perhaps in the short time now left us before the arrival of your friend, you will be good enough to tell us of something of your experiences of university life, so as to close the circle of observations, to which we were involuntarily urged, respecting our educational institutions, We may also be allowed to remind you that you, at an earlier age of your remarks, gave me the promise that you would do so. Starting with the public school, you claimed for it an extraordinary importance. All other institutions must be judged by its standard, according as its aim has been proposed, and, if its aim happens to be wrong, all the others have to suffer. Such an importance cannot now be adopted by the universities as a standard, for, by their present system of grouping, they would be nothing more than institutions where public school students might go through finishing courses. You promised me that you would explain this in greater detail later on. Perhaps our student friends can bear witness to that, if they chance to overhear that part of our conversation. We can testify to that, I put in. The philosopher then turned to us and said,
Well, if you really did listen attentively, perhaps you can now tell me what you understand by the expression, the present aim of our public schools. Besides, you are still near enough to this sphere to judge my opinions by the standard of your own impressions and experiences.
My friend instantly answered, quickly and smartly, as was his habit, in the following words. Until now we had always thought that the sole object of the public school was to prepare students for the universities. This preparation, however, should tend to make us independent enough for the extraordinary free position of a university student. For it seems to me that a student, to a greater extent than any other individual, has more to decide and settle for himself. He must guide himself on a wide, utterly unknown path for many years, so the public school must do its best to render him independent. I continued the argument where my friend left off. It seems to me, I said, that everything for which you have justly blamed the public school is only a necessary means employed to imbue the youthful student with some kind of independence, or at all events with the belief that there is such a thing. The teaching of German composition must be at the service of this independence. The individual must enjoy his opinions and carry out his designs early, so that he may be able to travel alone and without crutches. In this way he will soon be encouraged to produce original work, and still sooner to take up criticism and analysis. If Latin and Greek studies prove insufficient to make a student an enthusiastic admirer of antiquity, the methods with which such studies are pursued are at all events sufficient to awaken the scientific sense, the desire for a more strict causality of knowledge, the passion for finding out and inventing. Only think how many young men may be lured away forever to the attractions of science by a new reading of some sort which they have snatched up with youthful hands at the public school. The public school boy must learn and collect a great deal of varied information. Hence an impulse will gradually be created, accompanied with which he will continue to learn and collect independently at the university. We believe, in short, that the aim of the public school is to prepare and accustom the student always to live and learn independently afterwards, just as beforehand he must live and learn dependently at the public school. The philosopher laughed, not altogether good-naturedly, and said,
You have just given me a fine example of that independence. And it is this very independence that shocks me so much, and makes any place in the neighborhood of present-day students so disagreeable to me. Yes, my good friends, you are perfect, you are mature. Nature has cast you and broken up the molds, and your teachers must surely gloat over you. What liberty, certitude, and independence of judgment! What novelty and freshness of insight! You sit in judgment, and the cultures of all ages run away. The scientific sense is kindled and rises out of you like a flame. Let people be careful, lest you set them alight. If I go further into the question and look at your professors, I again find the same independence in a greater and even more charming degree. Never was there a time so full of the most sublime independent folk. Never was slavery more detested, the slavery of education and culture included. Permit me, however, to measure this independence of yours by the standard of this culture, and to consider your university as an educational institution and nothing else. If a foreigner desires to know something of the methods of our universities, he asks first of all with emphasis, how is the student connected with the university? We answer, by the ear as a hearer. The foreigner is astonished. Only by the ear, he repeats. Only by the ear, again we reply. The student hears. When he speaks, when he sees, when he is in the company of his companions, when he takes up some branch of art, in short, when he lives, he is independent, i.e., not dependent upon the educational institution. The student very often writes down something while he hears, and it is only at these rare moments that he hangs to the umbilical cord of his alma mater. He himself may choose what he is to listen to. He is not bound to believe what is said. He may close his ears if he does not care to hear. This is the achromatic method of teaching. The teacher, however, speaks to these listening students. Whatever else he may think and do is cut off from the student's perception by an immense gap. The professor often reads when he is speaking. As a rule, he wishes to have as many hearers as possible. He is not content to have a few, and he is never satisfied with only one. One speaking mouth, with many ears, and half as many writing hands. There you have, to all appearances, the external academic apparatus, the university engine of culture set in motion. Moreover, the proprietor of this one mouth is severed from and independent of the owners of the many ears, and this double independence is enthusiastically designated as academic freedom. And again, that this freedom may be broadened still more, the one may speak what he likes and the other may hear what he likes, except that, behind both of them, at a modest distance, stands the state, with all the intentness of a supervisor, to remind the professors and students from time to time that it is the aim, the goal, the be-all and end-all of this curious speaking and hearing procedure. We, who must be permitted to regard this phenomenon merely as an educational institution, will then inform the inquiring foreigner that what is called culture in our universities merely proceeds from the mouth to the ear, and that every kind of training for culture is, as I said before, merely achromatic. Since, however, not only the hearing, but also the choice of what to hear is left to the independent decision of the liberal-minded and unprejudiced student, and since, again, he can withhold all belief and authority from what he hears, all training for culture, in the true sense of the term, reverts to himself, and the independence it was thought desirable to aim at in the public school now presents itself with the highest possible pride as academical self-training for culture, and struts about in its brilliant plumage. Happy times when youths are clever and cultured enough to teach themselves how to walk. Unsurpassable public schools, which succeed in implanting independence in the place of the dependence, discipline, subordination, and obedience implanted by former generations that thought it their duty to drive away all the bumptiousness of independence. Do you clearly see, my good friends, why I, from the standpoint of culture, regard the present type of university as a mere appendage to the public school? The culture instilled by the public school passes through the gates of the university as something ready and entire, and with its own particular claims. It demands, it gives laws, it sits in judgment. Do not, then, let yourselves be deceived in regard to the cultured student, for he, insofar as he thinks he has absorbed the blessings of education, is merely the public schoolboy as molded by the hands of his teacher, one who, since his academical isolation, and after he has left the public school, has therefore been deprived of all further guidance to culture, that from now on he may begin to live by himself and be free. Free! Examine this freedom, ye observers of human nature, erected upon the sandy, crumbling foundation of our present public school culture. Its building slants to one side, trembling before the whirlwind's blast. Look at the free student, the herald of self-culture. Guess what his instincts are. Explain him from his needs. How does his culture appear to you when you measure it by 3 graduated scales? First, by his need for philosophy. Second, by his instinct for art. And third, by Greek and Roman antiquity as the incarnate categorical imperative of all culture. Man is so much encompassed about the most serious and difficult problems that, when they are brought to his attention in the right way, he is impelled betimes towards a lasting kind of philosophical wonder, from which alone, as a fruitful soil, a deep and noble culture can grow forth. His own experiences lead him most frequently to the consideration of these problems, and it is especially in the tempestuous period of youth that every personal event shines with a double gleam, both as the exemplification of a triviality and, at the same time, of an eternal surprising problem, deserving of explanation. At this age, which, as it were, sees his experiences encircled with metaphysical rainbows, man is, in the highest degree, in need of a guiding hand, because he has suddenly and almost instinctively convinced himself of the ambiguity of existence, and has lost the firm support of the beliefs he has hitherto held. This natural state of great need must of course be looked upon as the worst enemy of that beloved independence for which the cultured youth of the present day should be trained. All these sons of the present, who have raised the banner of the self-understood, are therefore straining every nerve to crush down these feelings of youth, to cripple them, to mislead them, or to stop their growth altogether. And the favorite means employed is to paralyze that natural philosophic impulse by the so-called historical culture. A still recent system, which has won for itself a worldwide scandalous reputation, has discovered the formula for the self-destruction of philosophy. And now, wherever the historical view of things is found, we can see such a naive recklessness in bringing the irrational to rationality and reason, and making black look like white, that one is even inclined to parody Hegel's phrase and ask, is all this irrationality real? Ah, it is only the irrational that now seems to be real, i.e., really doing something. And to bring this kind of reality forward for the elucidation of history is reckoned as the true historical culture. It is into this that the philosophical impulse of our time has pupated itself, and the peculiar philosophers of our universities seem to have conspired to fortify and confirm the young academicians into it.
End of 5th lecture, part 1. Fifth lecture, part 2 of On the Future of Our Educational Institutions by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by J. M. Kennedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
It has thus come to pass that, in place of a profound interpretation of the eternally recurring problems, a historical, yea, even philological, balancing and questioning has entered into the educational arena. What this or that philosopher has or has not, whether this or that essay or dialogue is to be ascribed to him or not, or even whether this particular reading of a classical text is to be preferred to that. It is to neutral preoccupations with philosophy like these that our students in philosophical seminaries are stimulated. Whence I have long accustomed myself to regard such science as a mere ramification of philology, and to value its representatives in proportion as they are good or bad philologists. So it has come about that philosophy itself is banished from the universities, wherewithin our first question as to the value of our universities from the standpoint of culture is answered. In what relationship these universities stand to art cannot be acknowledged without shame, in none at all. Of artistic thinking, learning, striving, and comparison we do not find in them a single trace, and no one would seriously think that the voice of the universities would ever be raised to help the advancement of the higher national schemes of art. Whether an individual teacher feels himself to be personally qualified for art, or whether a professional chair has been established for the training of aestheticizing literary historians, does not enter into the question at all. The fact remains that the university is not in a position to control the young academician by severe artistic discipline, and that it must let happen what happens, willy-nilly. And this is the cutting answer to the immodest pretensions of the universities to represent themselves as the highest educational institutions. We find our academical independence growing up without philosophy and without art, and how can they then have any need to go in for the Greeks and Romans? For we need now no longer pretend, like our forefathers, to have any great regard for Greece and Rome, which, besides, sit enthroned in almost inaccessible loneliness and majestic alienation. The universities of the present time consequently give no heed to almost extinct educational predilections like these, and found their philological chairs for the training of new and exclusive generations of philologists, who on their part give similar philological preparation in the public schools, a vicious circle, which is useful neither to philologists nor to public schools, but which above all accuses the university for the third time of not being what it so pompously proclaims itself to be, a training ground for culture. Take away the Greeks, together with philosophy and art, and what ladder have you still remaining by which to ascend to culture? For, if you attempt to clamber up the ladder without these helps, you must permit me to inform you that all your learning will lie like a heavy burden on your shoulders, rather than furnishing you with wings and bearing you aloft. If you honest thinkers have honorably remained in these 3 stages of intelligence, and have perceived that, in comparison with the Greeks, the modern student is unsuited to and unprepared for philosophy, that he has no truly artistic instincts and is merely a barbarian believing himself to be free, you will not on this account turn away from him in disgust, although you will, of course, avoid coming into close proximity with him. For as he now is, he is not to blame. As you have perceived him, he is the dumb but terrible accuser of those who are to blame. You should understand the secret language spoken by this guilty innocent, and then you, too, would learn to understand the inward state of that independence which is paraded outwardly with so much ostentation. Not one of these noble, well-qualified youths has remained a stranger to that restless, tiring, perplexing, and debilitating need of culture. During his university term, when he is apparently the only free man in a crowd of servants and officials, he atones for this huge illusion of freedom by ever-growing inner doubts and convictions. He feels that he can neither lead nor help himself, and then he plunges hopelessly into the workday world and endeavors to ward off such feelings by study. The most trivial bustle fastens itself upon him. He sinks under this heavy burden. Then he suddenly pulls himself together. He still feels some of that power within him which would have enabled him to keep his head above water. Pride and noble resolution asserts themselves and grow in him. He is afraid of sinking at this early stage into the limits of a narrow profession. And now he grasps at pillars and railings alongside the stream that he may not be swept away by the current. In vain, for these supports give way, and he finds he has clutched at broken reeds. In low and despondent spirits, he sees his plans vanish away in smoke. His condition is undignified, even dreadful. He keeps between the 2 extremes of work at high pressure and a state of melancholy enervation. Then he becomes tired, lazy, afraid of work, fearful of everything great, and hating himself. He looks into his own breast, analyzes his faculties, and finds he is only peering into hollow and chaotic vacuity. And then he once more falls from the heights of his eagerly desired self-knowledge into an ironical skepticism. He divests his struggles of their real importance and feels himself ready to undertake any class of useful work, however degrading. He now seeks consolation in hasty and incessant action so as to hide himself from himself, and thus his helplessness and the want of a leader towards culture drive him from one form of life into another. But doubt, elevation, worry, hope, despair, everything flings him hither and thither as a proof that all the stars above him by which he could have guided his ship have set. There you have the picture of this glorious independence of yours, of that academical freedom reflected in the highest minds, those which are truly in need of culture, compared with whom that other crowd of indifferent nature does not count at all, natures that delight in their freedom in a purely barbaric sense. For these latter show by their base smugness and their narrow professional limitations that this is the right element for them, against which there is nothing to be said. Their comfort, however, does not counterbalance the suffering of one single young man who has an inclination for culture and feels the need of a guiding hand, and who at last, in a moment of discontent, throws down the reins and begins to despise himself. This is the guiltless innocent, for who has saddled him with the unbearable burden of standing alone? Who has urged him to independence at an age when one of the most natural and peremptory needs of youth is, so to speak, a self-sundering to great leaders and an enthusiastic following in the footsteps of the masters? It is repulsive to consider the effects to which the violent suppression of such noble natures may lead. He who surveys the great supporters and friends of that pseudo-culture of the present time, which I so greatly detest, will only too frequently find among them such degenerate and shipwrecked men of culture, driven by inward despair to violent enmity against culture, when, in a moment of desperation, there is no one at hand to show them how to attain it. It is not the worst and most insignificant people whom we afterwards find acting as journalists and writers for the press in the metamorphosis of despair. The spirit of some well-known men of letters might even be described, and justly, as degenerate studentdom. How else, for example, can we reconcile that once well-known Young Germany with its present degenerate successors? Here we discover a need of culture which, so to speak, has grown mutinous, and which finally breaks out into the passionate cry, "I am culture!" There, before the gates of the public schools and universities, we can see the culture which has been driven like a fugitive away from these institutions. True, this culture is without the erudition of those establishments, but assumes nevertheless the mind of a sovereign, so that, for example, Gutskow, the novelist, might be appointed to as the best example of a modern public schoolboy turned aesthete. Such a degenerate man of culture is a serious matter, and it is a horrifying spectacle for us to see that all our scholarly and journalistic publicity bears the stigma of this degeneracy upon it. How else can we do justice to our learned men, who pay untiring attention to, and even cooperate in the journalistic corruption of the people? How else then by the acknowledgement that their learning must fill a want of their own similar to that filled by novel writing in the case of others, i.e., a flight from oneself, an ascetic extirpation of their cultural impulses, a desperate attempt to annihilate their own individuality? From our degenerate literary art, as also from that itch for scribbling of our learned men which has now reached such alarming proportion, wells forth the same sigh. Oh, that we could forget ourselves! The attempts fail. Memory, not yet suffocated by the mountains of printed paper under which it is buried, keeps on repeating from time to time, "A degenerate man of culture, born for culture and brought up to non-culture, helpless barbarian, slave of the day, chained to the present moment and thirsting for something, ever thirsting." Oh, the miserable guilty innocents, for they lack something, a need that every one of them must have, a real educational institution which could give them goals, masters, methods, companions, and from the midst of which the invigorating and uplifting breath of the true German spirit would inspire them. Thus they perish in the wilderness. Thus they degenerate into enemies of that spirit which is at bottom closely allied to their own. Thus they pile fault upon fault higher than any former generation ever did, soiling the clean, desecrating the holy, canonizing the false and spurious. It is by them that you can judge the educational strength of our universities, asking yourselves, in all seriousness, the question, what cause did you promote through them? The German power of innovation, the noble German desire for knowledge, the qualifying of the German for diligence and self-sacrifice, splendid and beautiful things which other nations envy you. Yea, the finest and most magnificent things in the world, if only that true German spirit overspread them like a dark thundercloud, pregnant with the blessing of forthcoming rain. But you are afraid of this spirit, and it has therefore come to pass that a cloud of another sort has thrown a heavy and oppressive atmosphere around your universities, in which your noble-minded scholars breathe warily and with difficulty. A tragic, earnest, and instructive attempt was made in the present century to destroy the cloud I have last referred to, and also to turn the people's looks in the direction of the high welkin of German spirit. In all the annals of our universities we cannot find any trace of a second attempt, and he who would impressively demonstrate what is now necessary for us will never find a better example. I refer to the old primitive Burschenschaft. When the War of Liberation was over, the young student brought back home the unlooked-for and worthiest trophy of battle, the freedom of his fatherland. Crowned with this laurel, he thought of something still nobler. On returning to the university, and finding that he was breathing heavily, he became conscious of that oppressive and contaminated air which overhung the culture of the university. He suddenly saw, with horror-struck, wide-open eyes, the non-German barbarism, hiding itself in the guise of all kinds of scholasticism. He suddenly discovered that his own leaderless comrades were abandoned to a repulsive kind of youthful intoxication. And he was exasperated. He rose with the same aspect of proud indignation as Schiller may have when reciting The Robbers to his companions, and if he had prefaced his drama with the picture of a lion, and the motto, In Tyrannos, his follower himself was that very lion preparing to spring, and every tyrant began to tremble. Yes, if these indignant youths were looked at superficiously and timorously, they would seem to be little else than Schiller's robbers. Their talk sounded so wild to the anxious listener that Rome and Sparta seemed mere nunneries compared to these new spirits. The consternation raised by these young men was indeed far more general than ever had been caused by those other robbers in court circles, of which a German prince, according to Goethe, is said to have expressed the opinion, "If he had been God, and had foreseen the appearance of the robbers, he would not have created the world." Whence came the incomprehensible intensity of this alarm? For those young men were the bravest, purest, and most talented of the band both in dress and habits. They were distinguished by a magnanimous recklessness and a noble simplicity. A divine command bound them together to seek harder and more pious superiority. What could be feared from them? To what extent this fear was merely deceptive or simulated or really true is something that will probably never be exactly known. But a strong instinct spoke out of this fear and out of its disgraceful and senseless persecution. This instinct hated the Burschenschaft with an intense hatred for two reasons. First, of all on account of its organization, as being the first attempt to construct a true educational institution, and, secondly, on account of the spirit of this institution, that earnest, manly, stern, and daring German spirit, that spirit of the miner's son, Luther, which had come down to us unbroken from the time of the Reformation. Think of the fate of the Burschenschaft when I ask you, did the German university then understand that spirit, as even the German princes in their hatred appeared to have understood it? Did the alma mater boldly and resolutely throw her protecting arms round her noble sons and say, "You must kill me first, before you touch my children"? I hear your answer. By it you may judge whether the German university is an educational institution or not. The student knew at that time at what depth a true educational institution must take root, namely, in an inward renovation and inspiration of the purest moral faculties, and this must always be repeated to the student's credit. He may have learnt on the field of battle what he could learn least of all in the sphere of an academical freedom, that great leaders are necessary, and that all culture begins with obedience. And in the midst of victory, with his thoughts turned to his liberated fatherland, he made the vow that he would remain German. German! Now he learned to understand his Tacitus. Now he grasped the signification of Kant's categorical imperative. Now he was enraptured by Weber's lyre and sword songs. The gates of philosophy, of art, yea, even of antiquity opened unto him, and in one of the most memorable of bloody acts, the murder of Kotzebue, he revenged, with penetrating insight and enthusiastic short-sightedness, his one and only Schiller, prematurely consumed by the opposition of the stupid world. Schiller, who could have been his leader, master, and organizer, and whose loss we now bewailed with such heartfelt resentment. For that was the doom of those promising students. They did not find the leaders they wanted. They gradually became uncertain, discontented, and at variance among themselves. Unlucky indiscretion showed only too soon that the one indispensability of powerful minds was lacking in the midst of them, and, while that mysterious murder gave evidence of astonishing strength, it gave no less evidence of the grave danger arising from the want of a leader. They were leaderless, therefore they perished. For I repeat it, my friends, all culture begins with the very opposite of that which is now so highly esteemed as academical freedom. With obedience, with subordination, with discipline, with subjection. And as leaders must have followers, so also must the followers have a leader. Here a certain reciprocal predisposition prevails in the hierarchy of spirits, yea, a kind of pre-established harmony. This eternal hierarchy towards which all things naturally tend is always threatened by that pseudo-culture which now sits on the throne of the present. It endeavors either to bring the new leaders down to the level of its own servitude, or else to cast them out altogether. It seduces the followers when they are seeking their predestined leader and overcomes them by the fumes of its narcotics. When, however, in spite of all this, leader and followers have at last met, wounded and sore, there is an impassioned feeling of rapture, like the echo of an ever-sounding lyre, a feeling which I can let you divine only by means of a simile. Have you ever, at a musical rehearsal, looked at the strange, shriveled-up, good-natured species of men who usually form the German orchestra? What changes and fluctuations we see in that capricious goddess form! What noses and ears! What clumsy danse macabre movements! Just imagine for a moment that you are deaf, and you had never dreamed of the existence of sound or music, and that you were looking upon the orchestra as a company of actors, and trying to enjoy their performance as a drama and nothing more. Undisturbed by the idealizing effect of the sound, you could never see enough of the stern, medieval, wood-cutting movement of this comical spectacle, this harmonious parody on the Homo sapiens. Now, on the other hand, assume that your musical sense has returned, and that your ears are opened. Look at the honest conductor at the head of the orchestra performing his duties in a dull, spiritless fashion. You no longer think of the comical aspect of the whole scene. You listen, but it seems to you that the spirit of tediousness spreads out from the honest conductor over all his companions. Now you see only torpidity and flabbiness. You hear only the trivial, the rhythmically inaccurate, and the melodiously trite. You see the orchestra only as an indifferent, ill-humored, and even wearisome crowd of players. But set a genius, a real genius, in the midst of this crowd, and you instantly perceive something almost incredible. It is as if this genius, in his lightning transmigration, had entered into these mechanical, lifeless bodies, and as if only one demoniacal eye gleamed forth out of all of them. Now look and listen. You can never listen enough. When you again observe the orchestra, now loftily storning, now fervently wailing, when you notice the quick tightening of every muscle and the rhythmical necessity of every gesture, then you too will feel what a pre-established harmony there is between leader and followers, and how in the hierarchy of spirits everything impels us towards the establishment of a like organization. You can divine from my simile what I would understand by a true educational institution, and why I am very far from recognizing one in the present type of university.
Translator's note. From a few MS notes written down by Nietzsche in the spring and autumn of 1872, and still preserved in the Nietzsche archives at Weimar, it is evident that he at one time intended to add a 6th and 7th lecture to the 5 just given. These notes, although included in the latest edition of Nietzsche's work, are utterly lacking in interest and continuity, being merely headlines and subheadings of sections in proposed lectures. They do not, indeed, occupy more than 2 printed pages, and were deemed too fragmentary for translation in this edition. End of On the Future of Our Educational Institutions by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by J. M. Kennedy. Recording by Aaron Rivera.